Thank you very much. First of all, on behalf of CSIR Executive, I would like to welcome you all to the beautiful CSIR ICC and to the CSIR campus, to the EU Ambassador, DDG Environmental Affairs, Acting Chief Director, DST, the chairs of the session and colleagues that are in the room today. It's my absolute pleasure to be here today and to present to you. The topic that was given to me to present on was around the African challenges for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and the role of knowledge transfer. And I must say that I am by no means an expert on the broad African challenges around achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And so what I would like to do is I would like to present my view of the challenges specifically through the lens of waste management, which is a sector that I've been involved in for around about 20 years. And specifically even further through the lens of South Africa's 10-year Waste Research, Development and Innovation Roadmap, which I'm tasked to implement on behalf of our Department of Science and Technology. And so if I can figure out how to get to the next slide. Tried that, tried the arrows, tried the page ups. All right, there. Yeah, it wasn't working. The innovation challenges facing Africa. Go back.
It's moving, but
it's
it's
okay.
taking long.
Oh, okay, it's taking long. Feels like me today. All right, so the outline of my presentation today, first of all, I'd like to introduce you to the 10-year Waste Roadmap. I'd like to look specifically at the SDG challenges for Africa and then take you within the framework of waste and the SDGs, the waste management challenges that we see emerging across the continent. And then I'd like to unpack what I see some of the opportunities in the waste sector for innovation and then some final conclusions. My apologies, it's taking quite a while from slide to slide. But essentially, the 10-year Waste Research is an initiative of our Department of Science and Technology. And it was published back in 2014, and it's essentially aimed at providing strategic direction to guide South Africa's public and private sector investment in waste research, development, and innovation. And it's focused specifically around 6 clusters, which I will show to you just now. The focus being around waste and around waste as secondary resource. But it's intended essentially to do 4 things. It's intended to lead to more effective decision-making, evidence-based policy, evidence-based decision-making. It's intended to lead to faster insertion of context-appropriate technology for South Africa. It's intended, hopefully, to also lead to export of know-how and to technology, not only within Africa, but globally. And 4th issue is to lead to strengthened RDI capability and capacity within the country. But ultimately, it's around providing the evidence base that we need as a country to implement national government's national waste management strategy and to implement the waste hierarchy which is embedded in our policy. The waste roadmap is focused on 5 specific waste streams that you see there, first and foremost being municipal waste, waste plastic, waste tires, electronic waste, and organic waste. And it's aimed at essentially maximizing the diversion of these waste streams away from our landfills into value-added opportunities. After essentially what was probably about 3 years of hard work with the public and private sector, that is the 10-year Waste Research, Development and Innovation Roadmap in a nutshell on one slide. It's based on a number of problems which South Africa faces with regards to waste management, the fact that 90% of our waste still goes to landfill, and I'll unpack some of these in a little bit more detail. It's resulting in us losing around about 17 billion rand, which is probably around about €1 billion worth of resources every year from our economy as waste. It's creating social and environmental impacts. And so these problems led us into saying, well, what are the research priorities and what are the research opportunities for South Africa to take us forward to address these problems and to turn these problems into opportunities? And so given the mandate of the Department of Science and Technology, it focuses around 3 core initiatives. It focuses around human capital development, particularly around postgraduate qualifications. It focuses around research and development, and it focuses around innovation, both technological and social innovation. And the 6 clusters that I spoke about that the roadmap is focused on is firstly strategic planning, which speaks to things like evidence-based policy. How do we make strategic decisions? How do we implement strategic initiatives and policies going forward? The second cluster that the roadmap focuses is on modeling and analytics, which is essentially the tools that we need as a country to inform our action. So things like life cycle analysis, cost-benefit analysis, techno-economic feasibility analysis, those kinds of tools. The third cluster, which is probably the heart of the waste roadmap, is around technology solutions. It's around appropriate technology solutions for South Africa. It's around technology adaptation, technology localization, and where necessary in terms of niche opportunities around technology development. The fourth cluster is around waste logistics performance. We're a big country, and so how do you move waste around the country? What makes sense if we're wanting to drive a secondary resources economy? For example, organic waste, where essentially you're transporting water. So how do we move things around? And that matches very closely to the technology solutions option in terms of saying, well, given the fact that we're a big country, is there opportunity for perhaps smaller scale, more modular technologies which can be applied closer to point of generation? The fifth cluster is around waste and the environment, and within this specifically, the focus is quite strongly on waste and climate. And lastly, the sixth cluster is around waste and society. I know that the International Solid Waste Association always talks about waste not being a technical or a technology issue, that it's a people issue, because at the heart of it, we are the ones that generate waste. And so I was really excited when this sixth cluster emerged, which is based very strongly in the social sciences. It's around behavioral change, but it's also around unlocking the social opportunities in terms of job creation and enterprise development. The Waste Roadmap is available on our website if anyone is interested in looking at it further. I'm not going to go into more detail on it now, but you can find it at wasteroadmap.co.za. So let's move on to the issue then of the SDGs and the challenge that I believe is facing us as Africa. I think given the fact that we stand at the brink of significant change in Africa, if you look at the projected population growth for the continent, I think by 2100, Nigeria is expected to have a larger population than the USA. We're expecting to see a significant increase in the middle class in Africa. We're expecting to see increases in consumption in Africa. And so the question then becomes, how do we balance this growth that we're going to see on the continent? And so for me, this diagram speaks very nicely to this balancing act that we have as we move forward on the continent. How do we achieve the social and economic SDGs that we have while making sure that we don't negatively impact on the planet and resources on the continent as well? And so for me, it hinges specifically around SDG 12 in terms of sustainable consumption and production, which also, thankfully, has quite a nice focus on waste management. Now, waste management is not only an SDG 11 or an SDG 12 issue. In fact, waste is a developmental issue, and so as a result, it cuts across all of the SDGs. And this diagram on the left-hand side speaks to just some of the waste challenges as they relate to the different SDGs, and also how some of the waste issues can provide opportunities for us in achieving the SDGs. And so knowledge generation and transfer, including research, development, and innovation, I think is key to realizing these positive impacts that we have the potential to create in Africa with regards to the SDGs. Now, given the time that I have available, I'm not going to go into waste management as it relates to all 17 SDGs, but I want to pull out specifically just a few SDGs as they relate to what we see as being some of the biggest waste management challenges on the African continent. And these challenges are emerging as we are finalizing the process of the development of the first Africa Waste Management Outlook for the United Nations Environment Programme. The first challenge that we're seeing is the very large informal waste sector. Not only in Africa, but globally, it's an issue, and very often it's the result of a bigger socio-economic problem that we're facing. Certainly in South Africa, we've seen a growing move of people into the informal sector as our unemployment rate increases, as our challenges around economic growth and the slowdown in our economy emerge. And if you look at the global waste management outlook, it's projected that there are around about between 12.5 and 56 million people who earn a livelihood in the informal waste sector, somewhere between 0.5 and 2% of urban population. If you look at some of the big cities within Africa, for Cairo, between 33,000 and 70,000 informal workers earning a livelihood from the recovery of waste. In Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, between 5.5 and 7,000. The figures for South Africa as a country is somewhere between 60 to 90,000, which is around 2 to 3 times the size of the formal waste sector in South Africa. But we suspect, given the fact that we in fact do not have very reliable data on this issue, that it could be as high as 215,000 people who earn a livelihood through the recovery of recyclables in South Africa. And so there's a lot of opportunity in terms of SDG 1, but also SDGs 8 and 5, around how we address the informal sector, how we integrate the informal waste sector into the waste economy, whether that be through integration, whether it be through professionalization, whether it be through formalization, whether it be through formal sector employment. There are a number of different models that are currently under discussion globally in this space around how the informal waste sector is integrated in and how their livelihoods are improved moving forward. To bring this back into the 10-year waste research, development and innovation roadmap space, we're currently funding a grant project which the DST awarded to Wits University, which is essentially around waste picker integration. And so it's a key project for us. It's a 3-year project. We're halfway through it. And it's looking specifically in South Africa at how we integrate the informal waste sector into our waste economy. And so the reality, photos like this are not unusual in South Africa and Africa, with large numbers of informal sector workers who really face many social, environmental, occupational health challenges as they try to earn a living. Also breaking the cycle from generation to generation. There's a lot of work being done, particularly in South America at the moment, around taking children off of dump sites and putting them into education. And it's a discussion that's emerging in South Africa and Africa as well, around moving children off of dumps and providing them with education to break the cycle. The second big challenge that I'd like to speak about facing Africa is the issue of food losses and waste. And it speaks particularly to SDGs 2, but also to 9 and to 17. It's estimated that approximately 1.3 billion tons, or around 1/3 of edible part of food produced for human consumption, is lost or wasted annually. It's approximately 56% of total food losses and waste occur in developed countries. And so you might say, well, what does that have to do with Africa, where most economies are developing? Well, I think the challenge is that given the levels of hunger and poverty on the continent, we don't have the luxury of wasting food. If you look at the projected population growth, for example, I mentioned Nigeria, as a small country with a predicted population larger than the USA, how do you feed that growing population? And so the challenge for innovation becomes, how do we produce food more smartly, that we're not losing 1/3 of agricultural production before it ever reaches the table? There's a lovely figure that, I'm trying to remember, a UK organization around the potatoes. I'm not sure if anyone's ever seen that, but the number of potatoes that are actually eaten out of 100, and it's actually 15. Out of 100 potatoes, only 15 are actually ever eaten. And so there's a lot that needs to happen in the space around food security. In South Africa, research that was done by my colleagues at the CSIR shows that also around about 30% of food is lost and wasted in South Africa. Unlike developed countries, most of our food losses and waste occur in early stage, so in field and during transport, due to, for example, the state of roads, due to the state of agricultural practices, cold storage, supply chains, etc. Whereas in developed countries, most of the food losses and waste are occurring at retail and at consumer level. But essentially, food losses and waste are costing us as a country around about 61.5 billion rand per annum, around about 2.1% of our GDP, which I think we can ill afford to do as a country. This is also a key priority for the waste roadmap. We actually held an industry meet science workshop earlier this year on food waste. And the industry meet science workshop series is essentially a mechanism such as this, where we bring business and industry and academia together to have a conversation around a particular topic. We've had 4 of these already, And what it essentially is aimed at doing is to make sure that we're investing our research in the problems that are facing business and industry in the country. And so business comes with its issues, with its priorities, with its concerns, and academia comes with its research, and hopefully in that process we create an opportunity to find matches between business and academia. And again, images like this are not unusual in terms of food losses, food wastage, food disposal to landfill sites. The next one that I'd like to speak about, which is probably one of the biggest challenges I believe facing Africa as a continent when it comes to waste management, is the issue of uncontrolled dumping. And this speaks particularly to SDG 11, but also to 3 and to 6. The data that we're seeing at the moment in terms of the draft Africa Waste Management Outlook is that the average waste collection coverage is only around about 55%. So that means only around about half of houses, businesses, etc., have access to some kind of waste collection service. The problem, though, is that more than half, more than 50% of the waste that is collected is then disposed of into uncontrolled dump sites. And we know, for example, that according to the Global Waste Management Outlook, 19 of the world's 50 biggest dump sites are in Africa. We know that we've got very low recycling rates generally across the continent. We estimate it only around about 4%. But then again, a big challenge facing us in Africa when it comes to waste management is just the lack of reliable data. In South Africa, I think you just have to drive around our cities and towns to see the amount of illegal dumping that's happening at curbside. We see this particularly for organic waste. We see it for construction and demolition waste. And that's very much a behavioral issue that we need to address in terms of making sure that people are taking their waste for safe disposal to proper sanitary engineered landfills. It's costing municipalities a fortune to collect this waste and to then take it to dump site, and that money could rather be spent in terms of other initiatives, whether it be around recycling, reuse, refurbishment, etc. We also know that in terms of the last official statistics for South Africa, that around about 90% of all of our waste still goes to landfill. We're currently funding a postgraduate scholarship. It's a number of scholarships, but I just particularly pulled out this one, around municipal waste that's looking at assessing the integration of sustainable waste management principles into dealing with illegal dumping in informal settlements. So you can see that as this research is conducted, as these scholarships and postgraduate studies are completed, we'll hopefully then have the evidence that we can feed into the national and the regional dialogue that's happening around how we achieve the SDGs. Again, images like this are not unusual in Africa, with waste just being dumped at curbside along streets due to lack of access to services or lack of or an unwillingness to pay for services in Africa for waste collection. And where waste is collected, it's being taken to dump sites like this, by no means sanitary engineered landfills. It's being taken to dump sites where there's very little compaction, very little cover, if any, and with a large number of informal pickers that are working at these tipping faces at landfill sites. The next SDG that I'd like to speak to specifically is SDG 13 and the impact that waste potentially has on climate change and on greenhouse gas emissions. And this stems particularly from the disposal of organic waste to land and to landfill, and the decomposition and the breakdown of that organic waste, whether it be anaerobic or aerobic, that produces either methane or CO2 and other landfill gases in the process. Globally, it's estimated that around about 12% of global methane emissions come from landfill sites. The last greenhouse gas inventory for South Africa suggests that the waste sector is the second largest contributor to total methane emissions in South Africa, contributing 37% roughly to total CH4. The problem, though, that we're seeing with regards to methane, though, is that while other sectors are showing declining contributions to methane, the methane from the waste sector, in fact, is increasing, and it has increased by around about 11%, which is reflecting this increasing waste generation. It's increasing this continuous waste disposal to landfill and increased tonnages of waste disposal to landfill, and particularly the disposal of organic waste to landfill. And I know that there are discussions. I know that the Western Cape Provincial Government Department, for example, is considering a ban on organic waste to landfill. which I think is fantastic. I think we have to, as a country, reach a point where we're seeing zero organic waste going to landfill in South Africa, and that we're diverting this opportunity waste stream into other things, whether it be into composting, whether it be into anaerobic digestion, whether it be into biorefinery in terms of high value and novel product recovery. With regards to the roadmap, we've got two exciting initiatives which are at this moment currently under development. We had a call earlier this year for the establishment of what will essentially be the first two SACHI research chairs in waste management. One of them will be in waste and climate, and one will be in waste and society. And the intention through these research chairs is to build the evidence base that we need as a country to fully understand the impact and the implications of the waste sector on climate and greenhouse gas emissions in South Africa. A photo from a landfill site in Africa which accidentally caught alight. It was the middle of winter. There were informal pickers that were working on the landfill site. It was cold. They started a fire to keep warm. The landfill site caught alight, and it burned for over a week. And you can just imagine the pollutants, the atmospheric pollutants that were coming out of this landfill site. They essentially had to open up the whole landfill site. They had the fire department there for a week pumping water into it, which obviously then creating leachate permeating down through the landfill, impacting on groundwater as well. I think this is the last SDG that I want to speak to, but it's very much an SDG and an issue and a topic that has emerged very strongly in the discourse globally, probably in the last year or 2 years, and that's the issue of marine plastic and the issue of marine litter. We know that 80% of all marine plastic actually comes from the mismanagement of waste inland. And if you think around the earlier slides that I showed, around the fact that we only have, a 55% coverage rate of waste collection, that 50% of the waste that is being collected is going to uncontrolled dumping, that we have open dumping on our streets and curbside, and then we look at this statistic, which shows us that 80% of marine litter comes from the mismanagement of waste inland. It's not coming mainly from waste that's being dumped overboard from ships. Yes, we know that that is an issue. We know that discarded fishing line and nets is an issue. But if we really want to address the marine plastic and marine litter issue, we have to be looking inland. We have to be going back to source to address these problems. The research that was published by Jambeck et al. On the state of marine plastic globally shows that in Africa, 5 of the top 20 countries are in Africa. And in order of priority, the first being Egypt, then Nigeria, South Africa, Algeria, and Morocco. But the problem that we're facing is that, yes, we still do have many pristine coastlines in South Africa. But if you go back to those statistics around a growing population, around a growing middle class, around growing consumption patterns, around growing tourism to the continent, we really are standing on the brink of significant potential impact on our marine resources if we don't do something about it. And yeah, in terms of the roadmap, the DST is partnering both with industry, with academia, with government, to see how we build the evidence base, how we take action against addressing this problem. And in fact, next week, as part of the Science Week on the 7th and 8th, there'll be a workshop with the Norwegian government, specifically around the marine plastic and the marine litter issue, around, as I said, building the evidence base and taking action, which is part also of the Africa Marine Waste Network, which was established earlier this year at a conference in Port Elizabeth. This is an incredibly disheartening photo that was taken, in fact, just this month, by a colleague from the Norwegian Environment Agency, if I remember correctly the title of the organization. But it was taken in Accra, Ghana, of PET bottles of plastic that in fact was just being washed down the river and accumulating on the shoreline in the area. And when I saw it, it just really breaks my heart in terms of where we're going as a continent and the future impacts that we're going to be seeing in this space if we don't take action. So, to move on from the challenges that are facing us, if I just look at the faces in the audience, I think I've put you all into a state of depression. I think that there are opportunities, and so there is some silver lining to the cloud. The opportunities that I see is that there are opportunities in terms of addressing the waste management challenges, both in terms of social and technological innovation. I always say that South Africa, and certainly Africa, is probably about 15 to 25 years behind Europe. And so The fact that we are behind provides an opportunity to learn from what others have done, what others have tried, and perhaps more importantly, what others have failed at, to make sure that we don't repeat the same mistakes. There's also significant opportunity to leapfrog what others have tried. And there's a lot of debate around thermal waste treatment, for example, thermal waste to energy, things like incineration, pyrolysis, gasification, to say, well, perhaps we don't need to go the same way that Europe has gone. Perhaps we could be driving a stronger materials recycling and a materials recovery economy as opposed to simply burning our waste. We also know that we've got limited R&D funding for waste in South Africa and in Africa, and so we don't have the luxury of reinventing the wheel when it comes to technology, when it comes to research, which means that there's a lot of opportunity for technology adaptation and localization of inbound technologies to the country. But I think it was mentioned earlier by Alan, was to say this is not a one-way communication. I think there's a lot of social innovation that is happening in Africa that in fact could be very useful for Europe as it transitions to the circular economy, which is being very strongly promoted at the moment, and hopefully we'll see emerge in terms of the new circular economy directives that are under discussion. So, the question that people then always ask me is, if there are so many opportunities for change, why aren't we already doing it? Why aren't we already diverting the majority of our waste away from landfill? Why do we have all of these challenges that are facing us as a country? And so I've highlighted 3 particular issues which I think are core to changing this paradigm around waste. I think the first is the effect around the lack of budget. Waste management is typically a municipal function, and budget availability is a key challenge for them. It's estimated that in developing countries, waste collection services or waste services can be between 15% and 50% of a municipal budget. The second challenge that's facing us is a lack of skilled capacity on the continent to inform decision-making around appropriate waste management technologies and solutions. And the third issue is if you look, for example, if you remember that slide that I showed you around the uncontrolled dump site, it's very cheap to operate a dump site like that, which skews the economics of waste management. It makes every other technology solution more expensive relative to dumping. And until such time as we transition our dump sites to sanitary engineered landfills, we're always going to have this distortion in the economies of waste management, which is going to make it extremely difficult for us to implement alternative waste treatment technologies. But having said that, those 3 issues I think are easy to address. I think the biggest challenge facing us when it comes to waste management in Africa is the lack of political will to do anything else other than the status quo. And this lack of political will that we're seeing across Africa negatively influences whether it be the adoption of legislation, whether it be enforcement of that legislation, whether it be directing funding into alternative solutions, whether it be staffing, whether it be capacity, whether it be technology uptake, whatever it might be, it's negatively influencing that change. Just last week, I was lecturing in Italy to a group of very mature MBA students. And at the end of the whole lecture around the circular economy opportunities for Africa, a gentleman stood up and said, "You paint a very rosy picture, but Italian businesses are coming to South Africa to explore opportunities, but they are not staying." And it comes down to the fact that we do not currently have an enabling environment for the private sector to essentially invest in technology and alternative solutions in Africa. I know Bank of America and Merrill Lynch scored the attractiveness of the African municipal solid waste market as very low in terms of the priorities or in terms of the criteria that they listed. And so the question becomes, how do we change this? How do we change this mindset around waste management? Because the opportunities do exist. And if we are going to achieve the SDGs, waste management is a key mechanism to help us get there. The reality is that the environment is not sufficient an agenda to change the way that we do things with regards to waste. And so images like this are a reality and will continue to be a reality unless we change that enabling environment and we change the political will to do something. I've mentioned this one around changing our paradigm from waste to secondary resource This is finding a lot of political traction in Africa at the moment because it unlocks opportunities for job creation and enterprise development. And it was a key issue that was part of the Waste Pakisa, which DDG mentioned earlier, recently held in South Africa. I think there's also opportunity to go beyond just the waste sector to also the circular economy. As I always say, the circular economy is not recycling. You know, it's always often used interchangeably. It's so much more than that. Just yesterday, there was a wonderful report, which I'm looking forward to reading on the plane to Cape Town this afternoon, published by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation on creating a circular textile and fashion industry. It's so much more than just waste. I think the exciting thing, though, in terms of the relevance of this workshop is that when it comes to the circular economy, whether you're in a developed or developing country, we're almost all standing at the same threshold of how we actually implement this, which creates wonderful opportunity to share information, to share knowledge, and to find appropriate solutions. You know, the drivers for Europe are not the same as the drivers for South Africa or for Africa in implementing the circular economy. And so we need to find what works for us as a country, as a region, in taking the circular economy forward. I think one of my last slides, partnerships are key to us. These are just some of the partnerships which have been established over the last 2 years in terms of the implementation of the waste roadmap, whether it be through collaborative research projects by academics at universities and science councils in South Africa, whether it be through postgraduate scholarships coming from other countries to South Africa to study based on projects and problems based in their own countries. And so partnerships are key, and I'm excited about the inno4sd network and also how the network can help us take some of the research and innovation opportunities forward within the waste roadmap. So my final concluding slide. I think reflecting back on the title in terms of the challenges facing Africa, but also the opportunities that waste presents in helping us to achieve the SDGs, is that I have no doubt that the waste sector can make a significant contribution towards achieving many, if not most, of the SDGs. Not solely, of course. But I think that we do need to drive a very strong waste prevention agenda. We do need to drive a very strong waste as secondary resource agenda to be able to unlock these environmental, social, and economic opportunities. I think in the process of doing that, we need to strengthen our capacity on the continent in terms of R&D and innovation. I think we need to strengthen partnerships, local, regional, and international partnerships in the space for knowledge transfer and technology transfer. And I think we need to create that enabling environment in terms of creating opportunities and incentives for innovation, certainly in my sector in the waste space. We have to, if we're going to achieve these opportunities, we have to eliminate uncontrolled dumping on the continent. We have to eliminate open burning, and we have to eliminate the trafficking of waste from developed to developing countries. And so for me, ultimately, if we want to achieve these impacts of the SDGs, for me it's around creating this enabling environment for change on the African continent. Thank you very much.